Welcome everybody to this climate change series presentation presented by the Rotary Club of Chapel Hill and the Meadowmont Aging in Place program and UNC's Wellness Center at Meadowmont. We're glad to have everyone here tonight. Let me introduce me. My name is Tom Wortman and I'm the president of the Rotary Club of Chapel Hill, and I'm particularly glad to be hosting this presentation with our two close partners and 2 or 3 other organizations that are supporting us. And we're very happy tonight to have as our speaker in this third edition of the Climate Change series, North Carolina's state climatologist, who has been here since just before the pandemic started in 2020. And to introduce her, here is Gary Barnes from the Meadowmont Aging in Place program and former president of the Rotary Club of Chapel Hill. Gary?
Thank you, Tom. Since some of you may not know what state climatologists do, I thought I would cover something that I picked up online. Most states have state climatologists. There's an American Association of State Climatologists. I think North Carolina figures prominently in that. But climatologists' responsibilities include analyzing and interpreting data obtained from Earth and atmosphere, reviewing past climate conditions, using models to conduct predictions of future climate trends, researching factors that affect climate and cause climate change. They provide information and advise policymakers in their states. Some draft models, all collaborate with climatologists, meteorologists, and professionals. Kathie has actually done this as a deputy climatologist in Oregon before she came here. So she's an Oregonian. She received her PhD in environmental sciences from Oregon State University, has a master's degree in geography, and a bachelor's degree in atmospheric sciences from the State University in Albany. And she, I think, is heavily involved in what I see in notes is called resilience planning and adaptive planning for the impacts of climate change. So Kathie, you can correct anything that I said that was not right and fill in what I didn't say.
No, that was perfect. My 2 secrets, I'm a New Yorker and an Oregonian. It's wonderful to be in North Carolina. Really happy to be here. And thank you so much for this really kind invitation. It's always great to get out and speak to folks. And I wish we could do this in person, and maybe someday in the future we can meet. But I do a lot of the things that Gary listed, but it feels like I also sit in a lot of meetings these days. But we also advise the media on temperatures and events and putting things into context. So it's been a really busy few weeks for us at the Climate Office. We're looking at the record warmest February on record at RDU Airport. And we're running about 9 degrees above normal for the start of the year. So obviously, those of us who suffer from allergies are feeling the pain of a very warm start to the year. But we're seeing trees and flowers bloom much, much earlier than we would expect them to, but also still have our eyes open for possibly a frost in March. We tend to get those here in North Carolina. So we're always on our toes at the Climate Office, and we're working with people who have to manage some sort of condition that maybe relates to climate. So we work with farmers and agricultural agents. We work with transportation planners. Tomorrow I have a meeting with some folks in the city of Raleigh. Really, our day-to-day varies a bit, but I'm not going to dig as much into the extreme weather as I thought I would. More of a general climate change talk in North Carolina, but plenty of time for questions. I recognize that I would go out and give these talks and people just wanted to talk. It's not often that you get to sit down with a climate scientist, so you'll have plenty of time to pick my brain. And like I said, we're advising the media on a lot of stories, and WRAL now has a climate change reporter. The News and Observer has a climate change reporter. And these are things that have changed, obviously, in the past 10 years. Newsrooms never really had a dedicated person reporting on climate change, but it's here now, it's everywhere, and it's in our face. And I would say we're giving maybe 5 to 7 interviews a week on topics that are of interest. And in August 2021, I was actually up in Asheville, and it was the rainiest day I had ever experienced. I had lived in Oregon for 10 years, but it was this one event that really, really stuck out, and it was Tropical Storm Fred. And this caused massive flooding up in Haywood County. There were 6 fatalities. They're still recovering from massive mudslides, big sediment damming up the Pigeon River. And if you see in this headline, it says the floods of 2021 were worse than they had ever experienced before. And our office keeps a lot of those data that can help put these things into context. And it was the worst flooding that they'd ever experienced. But a lot of what we do marries the data plus the lived experience, people's connection to the environment and how they're living. And if you tune out and go enjoy this abnormally hot February day, here's the take-home message. There are huge future changes in store for North Carolina if we as a planet continue to rely on fossil fuels as our main energy source. And what that means for us here in the state, this is a global problem, is temperatures outside of what we've seen historically. So when I say we're running 8 or 9 degrees above normal for the start of the year, we're shifting the odds toward warmer and not cooler. Really disruptive sea level rise. Many of you probably saw the video that circulated around of the 2 houses falling into the ocean in Rodanthe. We're seeing the impacts of climate change on our oceans in North Carolina right now. We're seeing more extreme rainfall. So I live in downtown Raleigh, and we can get a rainfall event of 3, 4, 5 inches. It's not going to make the newspaper because it happens pretty frequently now, but can cause disruptive flooding. And we're seeing this statewide. More intense hurricanes, so not necessarily in terms of the strength of the hurricane, but what's coming with them, the storm surge and the precipitation. And then if you're like me in summers, a bit torturous, higher humidity levels. So keeping those summer days and those summer nights in a place where it's not comfortable for many of us, but can be really fatal for people who have to work outside or may lack access to air conditioning. And if we're just backing up, so we do look at historical records, and data is our most reliable thing. We have thermometers, we have rain gauges that have been collecting data for over a century. And North Carolina's warmed about 1 degree Fahrenheit in the recent past. It does not sound like very much, I know. So if I told you tomorrow it's going to be 1 degree warmer, or if I asked you to turn down the thermostat 1 degree, really wouldn't make a difference. But we're talking about this overall average. So to get an average temperature change of 1 degree Fahrenheit, every station has to go up a little bit to average together. So we're seeing more of those days, and especially warm nights, which I'll talk a little bit about, to get to this change. And we're shifting the background state. So every day isn't consistently 1 degree warmer than it would have been. And we do see swings from warm to cold still. And then when you look at this trend over time, that was a map, but this is obviously a graph from NOAA. Only 1 year in the past 20 has been below the 20th century average. So we have been consistently warmer. We're starting off another warm year. We ended a warm year last year. It's undeniable that North Carolina is warming and will continue to warm. There's this period in the 50s and 60s where the Southwest US was cooler than the rest of the US, and it didn't warm as fast. And we attribute this to some natural variability. We attribute this to some land use practices, but North Carolina has caught up to the planet, which has warmed about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. But when we really dig into it, with the exception of these last 2 months, nights and not days are getting hotter. So this comes from the North Carolina Climate Science Report. It's a report I worked on with 15 other climate scientists in North Carolina and was delivered to the governor as part of Executive Order 80. And what we looked at was the number of very hot days in the left panel, that's days with the maximum temperature over 95. And then we looked at the number of very warm nights, days with the minimum temperature over 75. So there's not really a huge trend in the hot days, but there is a pretty noticeable one in the hot nights. And for a while, we were setting a new minimum temperature record every single year, starting with 2018. So warm nights may not feel like such a problem. It cools down, we're sleeping, but if you are outside working all day and then you come back to a place that doesn't have air conditioning, or you're already physiologically stressed from a hot day, this can cause lots of complications. And we see people go to the emergency room with heat exhaustion and other forms of heat illness. But in the future, our models show that both of these are going to increase. And coupling those with increases in humidity, we're looking at a pretty big public health risk. I was just telling a group of students this morning, we find a lot of times that people say, it's North Carolina, it's hot, I'm used to this, but we're really not used to this. We keep shifting beyond the average and we haven't completely acclimated. So especially when you see heat earlier in the year, you start to see more people checking into the emergency room or going to see their doctor, just because we haven't adjusted, and we haven't really adjusted entirely. But switching over to rain pretty quickly, there's no trend in annual precipitation. There's maybe a slight one, but none of us really think about precipitation annually. I bet if I asked you how much rain fell in Raleigh last year, you wouldn't know. And very few people know that answer. But when we look at the year-to-year variation, some years are very wet. So 2018, which is the last dot on this graph. That was the year where we had Hurricane Florence, but it was also a really wet year overall. And then after that, we've dried out pretty rapidly. We've seen incidences of drought. We just got out of drought in the past few weeks in North Carolina. So we're swinging between wet and dry. But when we're wet, it's really driven by those extreme precipitation events. And we're seeing a shift in that. I'll show you a plot. So I do consult with state agencies, and one of them texted me one day and said, it feels like it's getting rainier. Can you put together a briefing for us? And we did just that. We looked at extreme precipitation, how it's changing throughout the season at a number of those sites on the map that I showed you. And we looked at the 95th percentile, because an extreme event in Wilmington isn't necessarily an extreme event in Asheville, which is actually our driest part of the state. And we broke it down by season, and we also looked at 30-year chunks. So the green is 1950 to 1980, essentially a historical average. Sorry, I live by the train station, to 1991 to 2020, which is the recent era. One of the things that we've seen jump out, especially, is an increase in summer and fall precipitation. And we haven't necessarily dug into the mechanism behind it, but you could guess that it's probably driven by tropical activity in the summer and the fall. But there's been an increase in almost every season except for winter. Now going forward, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit more contextual stuff. I said that there are big changes in store for North Carolina if we as a planet continue using fossil fuels the way that we do. And we are part of this global problem, but it's causing impacts here in our state. So what does the future look like for North Carolina? And we have one planet and we're living on it, and we are performing an experiment on it. We're adding heat trapping gases to our atmosphere. But science usually has to duplicate the thing that it's performing the experiment on somehow. So my younger nieces hear I'm a scientist and they think I'm working with animals and potions, and they get really bored when they hear what I actually do. But we recreate the planet in a computer, and we build computer models. And they put us through years and years of physics and math, and we know the equations that dominate a normal planet. So we've got that all down, and we put that into the computer. And these are run all around the world. Our office doesn't necessarily run one, but there's about 30 of these modeling centers around the world. So that's fine. We've recreated a planet. We know how it should work. The really hard part about the planet and the really hard part about this problem is not the physical science, it's the people. How are people going to behave over the next 100 years? What are we going to do as a planet? Are we going to enact any policies to reduce our fossil fuel use? Are we going to adapt to this problem? We start putting those things into the models as well. And I'm just showing you two scenarios here. One in the red is a higher emissions global scenario. We keep using fossil fuels the way that we have been. We don't really transition toward renewables very quickly. We keep building and using land the same way that we have, kind of a business as usual scenario. And the green is a lower emission scenario. So that's us as a planet getting together and adhering to some of the targets that we set in these big international treaties, shifting toward a renewable portfolio, adding in some innovations, maybe to capture carbon, using land differently, some pretty big shifts from what we're doing, but it's still plausible and it's still possible. So we've got these two different scenarios for you, the one where we don't really do very much and the one where we do a lot. And you can see they give us quite a range of what the temperature may look like in 50, 80 years. And you'll notice that the two scenarios don't diverge too much until about mid-century. There is some memory in the atmosphere. We've already bought into some warming. If we leave the Zoom and we find out that everyone has stopped using fossil fuels on the planet, we would still continue to warm a little bit. So when we're thinking about the next 20, 30 years, we're thinking about resilience. We're thinking about adaptation. How do we live with the changes that are coming toward us? But when we start to think about the next generation and the 2050s to the end of the century, the two scenarios, there's a pretty big range. And that range is there for a number of reasons. The models all treat people and aspects of the climate a little bit differently. But also going back to what I said, we don't really necessarily know how people will act. And we have to try to figure out how 7-8 billion people might respond to this problem. But it gives us a best guess, and it shows us that if we do make these big policy changes, we could see a North Carolina that warms about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So backing up to what I told you, we've warmed a degree Fahrenheit, and we're seeing the impacts of climate change. 4 is still a different state, but it's not as bad as what it could be, which is a best guess of about 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century in North Carolina, which is a completely different state than you or I know. And that's coupled with all the other changes that are happening. People are moving here. We love living in North Carolina, and other people love living in North Carolina, but it's never just the climate. And a few of you are probably saying, well, why should I trust your computer models? And that's a fair question. We scientists ask that of ourselves. We can go back to those dots that I showed you at the beginning and tell the models, okay, go ahead and recreate the 20th century. We have data for that. We can try to match it up. And that's what you see here in the gray. So that's the models recreating the 20th century in North Carolina. The orange lines up for the most part. It doesn't capture that cooling very well, but there are lots of people studying that. But we're essentially on that path. And if I added in the extra data from beyond the report, we would have jumped up a lot more too. So we're warming and we'll continue to warm. What does this mean for me and you? Like I said, climate, it's never just climate. It's a threat multiplier. And we're already dealing with a lot of inequities in this state and in this country. Climate change is hitting those who are poorest, hit first and worst, low-income communities of color. And people who are already at risk for heat illness in rural North Carolina are going to be more threatened by climate change. So I really liked this series that the News and Observer did about, oh wow, almost 3 years ago. It feels like just yesterday. about agricultural workers and their living conditions, their lack of access to cooling, but often we're also talking about people who can't advocate for themselves. They are undocumented migrant workers, and there are not a lot of protections against heat for those folks. So we're looking at a state that may be impossible to work in during some hours in the future. So when I show it on a map like this, and this is from the last National Climate Assessment, the next one is coming out this year, and I'm a part of it, shows that outdoor laborers are the most vulnerable to heat-related deaths. It's not a surprise. We worry about high school football players, we worry about construction workers, but people who are working outside experience heat illness and death the most. And when you try to frame this as what this may do to companies' bottom lines, you know, we talk to people about climate in many different ways. We're looking at a change in hours worked in central and eastern North Carolina. Probably some of the highest numbers, so about 5 to 6%, where you will not be able to send somebody outside to work because it will be fatal. And this is a fossil fuel intensive world. It's that red scenario that I showed you. Again, there's still time for us to make some changes. And then when we think about flooding, a lot of us buy really expensive property without truly understanding the actual flood risk, because a lot of our flood maps are out of date. And we use something called the 100-year floodplain. It's poorly understood by the public. And a lot of flooding actually happens outside of the 100-meter floodplain. So we need new maps, we need new estimates of historical precipitation, but also what may happen in the future. And it doesn't mean that floods just happen once every 100 years. It means that there's a 1% chance in any given year for a 100-year flood. These are some slides from my colleague at UNC. She does a lot of work on this, but it's not just the 100-year floods we're worried about. Hurricane Florence was a 500,000-year event. We're seeing these things that are way outside of the historical envelope happening, and we have to plan for them, and we have to forecast them, and we have to message them, but people don't have anything to contextualize it. And the floodplain doesn't really deal with flooding from other hazards. So we love North Carolina, like I said, because it's beautiful and we get to go to beautiful beaches and mountains, but compound flooding is a really big problem. We have storm surge. Sometimes we'll get big rain on top of it. And then you'll get water coming down from Raleigh down the Neuse that will add extra water to the system. And then, oh, there's groundwater recharge too. So it's kind of coming at people from all angles. So we're thinking about the complexities when it comes to flooding. But there's also just pluvial urban flooding, extreme precipitation, but also some storm sewer recharge. A lot of our water infrastructure was not built for the climate that we're living in, and certainly wasn't built for the climate that we're moving into. And then just thinking about future precipitation, because we talked about future temperature, it's likely that annual precipitation in North Carolina will increase. So I told you it hasn't increased. It'll bump up a little bit because it's driven by those extreme events. And it's virtually certain, which is the highest category that we climate scientists use, that it's due to having more water in the system. So it's more humid. We've got a warmer ocean, a warmer atmosphere, and a warmer atmosphere just holds more water. And when that warmer atmosphere has water, it's very likely that it will all fall in an extreme way and flood us. We're seeing this now, and we'll see this into the future. So when we look at how this plays out across the state in the future, I'm just going to talk about the bottom two here. The lower emissions scenario and the higher emissions scenario for mid-century. So whenever we make these graphs, I realize we're moving closer and closer to mid-century, but increases across the entire state. This is showing a percent change of number of days, but especially an increase in the mountainous areas of North Carolina. So going back to Tropical Storm Fred and Haywood County and the flooding that they experienced, can we see more Freds in the future? Will we see more Freds in the future? The terrain there is like an egg carton. And when you dump a ton of water on it, it flows down into the divots really, really fast. So that's a major concern of ours. We tend to think about flooding on the coast. I just talked about it, but when reporters call and ask me what my kind of number one climate fear is, it's flooding across the entire state. And then in North Carolina, we have a lot of homes in the wildland urban interface, one of the top in the country, almost 2 million homes. And this was surprising to me. I'd lived out west. I had dealt with a lot of wildfire. I would be very happy never seeing another wildfire in my life. But we have a lot of structures and people at risk to fires that we get here, sometimes infrequently, but they do happen. So North Carolina is going to see an elevated fire risk, especially in the western part of the state, especially in the shoulder season. So that's spring and fall, where we can see rapid drying and warming like we're seeing right now. And we're just not fire safe. This is a photo from Gatlinburg, just over the border in 2016. A number of structures were damaged in this fire and a few people died as well. So thinking about Western North Carolina's fire risk, we're talking with people about building fire safe structures, but even if the structure is already there, defensible space, clearing out debris and land, but also how do you evacuate quickly if there's a fire when there aren't a lot of roads there? These are really complex problems. And like I said, it's never just climate. And I'm going to stop talking and leave time for questions. Climate change is here and now in North Carolina. It's not a future thing. It is behind us. It's here, and it's definitely in the future, but we're not talking about it as a distant thing anymore. Increased fire, flood, and heat risk in North Carolina. I didn't talk about diseases and pests, but in a warmer climate, we could start to see some of those really nasty tropical type viruses that we don't like. Right now, this is an equity issue. People with means can get out of harm's way or get out of harm's way, but climate change is hurting our poorest first and worst. And it will impact our bottom line. So we have a thriving economy in North Carolina. We want a thriving economy in North Carolina. There will be hours of work lost due to unsafe conditions, not just heat, but I talked with a company that wanted to know about all the risks to their business. And one of them was if the road is flooded, their employees can't get to work that day. So thinking through some of these things. And we're urbanizing. We're urbanizing rapidly in the Southeast. Raleigh-Durham is one of the fastest growing housing markets. And we have people moving into places that may not be climate safe. And we're building and we're adding impermeable surface. And we have an opportunity here to think through what a climate smart or climate resilient community looks like. But it will enhance our climate challenges, and rural communities especially have less adaptive capacity, usually less revenue, less political capital. Their emergency manager is probably doing 18 jobs, including what one of my colleagues said, is hanging up the Christmas decorations on Main Street. So climate's just one more thing on top of that. And then increasing pressure from second, third, and fourth homes. So thinking about housing affordability and who can live in a climate safe place. We're going to have big challenges. But like I said, and I want to end this on a positive note, we still have time. The train hasn't completely left the station, but it's moving, and we need to get on it. But also thinking about the things that make a community nice and livable are also climate resilient. So access to food and housing and just a safe way to live, access to green space, access to shade and public transportation. We don't have to call things climate resilient. So we can talk about making our communities better and then become climate resilient too. So thank you for your time and attention, and I'll take any questions.
Kathie, Gary Barnes. I have the feeling that North Carolina may be less negatively affected than some of the other states in the country. I have a daughter in California, and I look at what's happening there, and you know, of course, what's happening in Oregon. But am I correct that North Carolina may not be as harmed as some other states?
I don't know that there's a place where we can run from climate change. So when I took the job, everyone in Oregon's like, you're driving right into climate change. Hurricane Florence had just happened, and the big heat wave and the big fires hadn't happened in the West at that point. So it's their turn now, but it's our turn too. I would say that I'm from upstate New York. I look at upstate New York as, is this my climate refuge? But they're also dealing with problems as well. That massive snowstorm that they got in Buffalo. It's kind of like a whack-a-mole game. At any given time, you can open the newspaper and see just a climate impact playing out. So, well, I would say here in the Triangle, we're a little bit buffered from some of the tropical events, which is nice. I'm not necessarily saying we're less harmed.
Actually, this is Bob Anthony. I remember reading something a few years ago that was talking about ocean sea rise, and said that Tyrrell County in northeastern North Carolina was one of the most vulnerable counties on the whole East Coast. That's low to begin with, and there are few people there. So it may not have quite the dramatic interest that some other areas do, but I think we've got some challenges in the state with sea rise as well as that a result of temperature change. But,
yeah, absolutely. And I didn't show this slide, but one of my colleagues who's also at UNC showed that for every house that we're buying out in North Carolina, we're building 10 more in the floodplain. So we're actually going backwards.
So I think this might be a related question. You mentioned that people are building places that may not be climate safe. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So we did an urban heat mapping study in Raleigh and Durham in 2021, and the places that are the hottest are the places that tend to have the most affordable housing. Or in Durham's case, we're redlined historically. Raleigh wasn't redlined. And we might be building in places where there's a flood risk. We're continuing to develop places like Cary pretty rapidly and maybe not thinking about all the different consequences. Downtown Raleigh is developing pretty rapidly. We have some flash flooding risks as well. It's just, we tend to not think about these things pretty holistically. It's let's build a 20-story building and not really think about what's happening. So I said we still have an opportunity.
So you live in downtown Raleigh. What kind of issues do people who live near you face?
It's really hot, but also I would say flooding. And these aren't the events that make CNN or even the News and Observer anymore, but we'll get 5 inches of rain. You don't go to the mall because Crabtree Mall's parking garage is basically like right there by the creek and floods all the time. But we'll see roads cut off here. The train station will flood, or the road into the train station will flood.
Kathie, I have a question. The lead-in would be, who's listening to you in Raleigh? And a couple of examples. The recent plan that Duke Energy submitted, their carbon plan that the Utility Commission approved, I think somewhere in there the governor had a role, has caused a lot of concern among people that it's still increasingly dependent upon natural gas. It's not. They tout that we have a lot of solar, but really the new plan doesn't go too far with that. I believe they're eliminating their solar panel rebates next year, at least they are for our church. And I think they've decreased the buyback that they do from homes that have solar panels that have excess energy to sell back. So that's one example. A second is I was just reading about, I don't know if it's the forestry department, but a decision to log, I think it was 6,000 acres in maybe Pisgah National Park or somewhere in that area, which is increasing like, I don't know, like tenfold increase over what's been logged. And then a sore point that I've had lately is the wood chip industry and the damage that that's doing to that they're actually cutting down trees and not just picking up scraps of wood. And so when you're eliminating trees, that's not helping. And Duke's plan seems to be problematic. So I was wondering what influence do you, your office, or the governor's office have, or do you think people are hearing what you have to say and making some decisions about this, particularly the legislature?
So I can answer this a few ways, but I will note that I'm at NC State University, even though I'm wearing blue, don't tell them. So I've got the smokestack behind me. And I operate independent of the legislature and the governor's office. And that's a plus because we are bound by science and scientific literature, and I report to the dean like any other faculty. So that's how I'm working. I do give information to policymakers on both sides of the aisle. That's what our office does. We tend to not get into individual policy level discussions. That's just, it's not our role. There is an Office of Resiliency and Recovery, there's DEQ. We're often providing them the science support to then make policies, but I'm not jumping in and commenting specifically on individual plans. Who's listening? I don't know. And sometimes, it feels like one of those cartoons where you're screaming and screaming and no one's listening. That being said, I've been doing this for a long enough time and the attitude has changed a lot. I used to get some really nasty hate mail, people following me around, harassing me. That has gone down significantly. And it might be because people in North Carolina are just nicer than people in Oregon. But I think there's a reality and folks really just want to discuss solutions and not point fingers at problems. So that's where we have had some success working in some rural communities where people said, you're never going to get in there and talk about climate change. And we do. We just meet people where they are. So that's kind of a long discussion to say, I don't get very involved in the political side, but I will give talks like this and say, we need to change our practices or else here's what's coming.
I worked at a college in Pennsylvania where I was in charge of sustainability projects there. And I found that it was a very difficult job because you had to walk the line between the people who said you're not doing enough, you're not doing it fast enough, you're not doing it strong enough, you're not devoting enough money to it, and the people who said, crazy tree hugger, this is not important. You should be spending your time on more important things. Do you feel that sort of thing too in your job?
Yeah, I have been yelled at in the same day by a climate activist and a climate denier. And you're like, who is happy with me right now? Our office serves all 10.5 million North Carolinians, and not everyone is going to be happy at all times. But we do, I think, all share a common goal, like I said, of loving the state and just trying to do better. But there is a careful line to walk, not just out of politics, but also just knowing that when you go into a community, they're grappling with so much already. We're all worried about the economy and COVID and getting kids to soccer practice. And climate is a lot, and I'm thinking about it all the time. So there's a lot of empathy too that I have for people who might be a little bit skeptical, but also for the people who really want us to do more.
Do you get disheartened?
No, I don't get disheartened for a few reasons. One, we have incredibly talented people in North Carolina working on this problem, from the people who do the policy to our scientists to our academic institutions. It's a really fantastic team. And I think we're always pushing the envelope. And honestly, we're ahead of Oregon. Don't tell them I said that, but they get all the press for being very progressive about climate, but we're doing a lot of really smart things. And also the thing that really keeps me going is I work with a lot of students at the university. They care a whole lot. Very, very sharp, speaking truth to power in a way that my generation didn't. And that motivates me because there's a lot of climate anxiety and a lot of people that I love with children.
Kathie, several years ago in North Carolina, and I'm not good with the number of years, but I would guess maybe 5 to 10 years ago, there was a debate in the legislature about what kind of statistics the state could release about sea level rise. And legislators and property interests wanted to limit the official predictions of sea level rise to historical trends. Others wanted to use new global warming models. And I think eventually the legislature backed off of imposing restrictions. But my question is, this is a pretty conservative legislature that we have now. I think we do have still some climate deniers. Any legislation impinge on what you're trying to do in your office?
So my funding comes through the university and also external grants, and I do get some state agency money as well, but it's a research grant. I will say that last year the GA passed a $25 million bipartisan flooding bill. So the state is going to undertake a big flooding risk project, North Carolina Flooding Blueprint. I'm going to be part of it. A number of people are going to be part of it. Yeah, I think that people see the writing on the wall, that we have a flooding problem, that we have climate problems. Maybe we're not using the C word, but I don't feel dejected by any of it. I feel pretty hopeful. And I know what you're talking about with the sea level rise. Everyone referenced The Daily Show when I got here.
Do you hear many people talk about hurricanes? We've had, from Floyd and ones like that in recent years, that maybe people are thinking they're stronger, the intensity. Is there much concern being expressed about that and connecting it to climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. So even going back to Floyd and Fran, but Matthew and Florence were, I would say, the two behemoth ones that folks really said, whoa. And we have people who still aren't back in their homes from Matthew, which was 7 years ago. And Florence was a weak hurricane. It was barely a category 1, but it just rained and rained and rained. And that, I think people said, oh, wait, it doesn't have to be a category 4 hurricane for it to be bad. There's more moisture in the atmosphere. So definitely the Florence connection has been made. I will say, though, that it kind of feels like we're always waiting for the other shoe to drop with hurricane season. What are we, 94 days out? I usually have the countdown top of mind. And last year it was really, really quiet until Hurricane Ian. But what is the next Florence? It's coming. And I think there's a lot of anxiety in Eastern North Carolina over that.
Well, great. This has been pretty enlightening. We have about 5 minutes left, and I'm certain that among the 20 or so participants we have here, there are some burning questions that people want to know about. Here's your last chance to ask your question.
Well, if it's my last chance, it'll be my last question too. The state is divided into a coastal plain, a Piedmont, a mountainous area. What are the risks for the coastal plain? The risks from sea level rise?
Flooding in all three. The mechanism that's driving the flooding is different. the coastal plain it's so flat. And we think about the Outer Banks, but the 18 counties east of 95 are all pretty flood prone, have tidally driven rivers, are getting water from here in the Piedmont, and are seeing more extreme precipitations. And coupling that with sea level rise on the immediate coast. And it's not just our homes and our infrastructure or NC12, which we didn't even talk about, but we have ghost forests on the coast. And one of my colleagues at NC State does a lot of research on that, and just a lot of loss of habitat because of saltwater intrusion.
I was recently listening to a recording of a summit called the Waters Summit. Are you familiar with it?
I am.
It happened last. And in one of those things, one of the legislators, I don't remember exactly which one, was saying it's really important that we get going on dredging. Do you think dredging is the solution for dealing with flooding?
Dredging is one of a portfolio of solutions. So like when we're thinking about reducing our fossil fuel use, it's not just going to be one thing. It's not going to be just electric cars. And we definitely have to look at some of the sediment loads in our rivers and some of our land use. A number of colleagues look at the interplay between land use and climate change and what dominates. Right. So it's a piece of it.
Yeah. Well, I think it was the same one. He's from the coastal plain, and he was complaining about all that clay that's coming from the Piedmont.
Yeah,
what he wants to do is dredge it so it washes into the ocean instead of backing up in his land.
I would say in a wicked problem like this, we've got to put all the options on the table.
I agree. Thanks.
Great. That's a good question. So, as I was saying, let me be the first to thank you for coming in tonight. Kathie, this was most definitely an exceptional presentation. And we all appreciate it. I also want to give a chance for Sandy Roberts or Gary Barnes to give a final word. Let's start with Sandy.
I think I want to thank you, Kathie. I learned a lot and I feel hopeful, and I hope that we as individuals can absorb things and turn them around into some kind of active, so we don't feel so helpless and hopeless in our own little daily lives. So I think that we need to be thinking always of ways that we can take away from the problem instead of adding to the problem. I think it's good always to be thinking in those terms. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And Kathie, my comment is that this has just been an excellent presentation. It's going to be recorded and even done on YouTube, as we've done on the others. When we announce future events, we will remind people they can go back and see this. We'll encourage them to do it. So I hope it gets a lot more attention than just the 20 folks who have been with you today, because it deserved it.
20 attentive folks, over 200 people on their phones. So it was great chatting with you all. And it's a beautiful day. I don't blame anybody for being outside right now. We've got to find joy in some of the dark moments.
Right.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Kathie.
Right.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. We'll get this presented on and posted on YouTube. And please encourage your colleagues and friends and family to come to our next session, which I think is March 28th.